Welcome to the Wade Center's podcast.
A podcast of Wheaton College.
The point of loving your enemies is that you don't want to defeat them, you want to convert them. You want them to end up on your side. You want your enemy to betray his side and come to your side. And he did it by, using the sword just for the argument, but always keeping his personal charity and amity very clear, so that people were never offended by him. They could not withhold their affection for him because he was so affectionate. And so these philosophical opponents of his, they all had great personal relationships with him. And Shaw's a great example, but the other one is H.G. Wells, with whom they didn't agree on anything, on nothing, and yet they would spend weekends together at each other's homes.
Welcome to the Wade Center podcast. We are so excited because we have with us today one of the, if not the most famous person in Chesterton studies living today. Dale Ahlquist is the president and co-founder of the Society of Gilbert Keith Chesterton and the publisher of the magazine Gilbert, which first appeared in 1997 and is still being read with appreciation. He has written or edited 17 books by and about Chesterton, and for 7 seasons, he hosted a television series called The Apostle of Common Sense. In 2012, Ahlquist was named a senior fellow of the Chesterton Library at Oxford University. Dale, thank you so much for joining us today.
A great pleasure to be with you both.
My first question to you is how you got interested in Chesterton.
Well, I was a big C.S. Lewis fan, as so many people of my generation still are. I was reading Mere Christianity. I was sitting on the couch in the apartment of my sister and her husband. Her husband was Larry Norman.
Yeah, and to our younger listeners, you may not recognize that name, but Larry Norman is usually considered the father of Christian rock music. Isn't that right?
That's what they tell me. And certainly that's what I believed that at the time. So we're talking about the 1970s. That's when this was happening. I was on a summer job working for Larry in his office and recording studio. And
we often have musical segments, so this would be the time to sing, I Wish We'd All Been Ready. That was one of his big famous songs, right?
That was a very famous song, and I have to tell you, David, I wish I had been ready for what happened next. He said, and this is a rock singer with long hair who I knew was very intellectual. I saw him always reading a magazine, but I'd never seen him crack open a book. And he says to me, "Oh, you like C.S. Lewis?" I said, "Yeah, I love C.S. Lewis." He says, "Have you ever read G.K. Chesterton?" I said, "I've never heard of G.K. Chesterton." And he said, "If you like C.S. Lewis, you'll like Chesterton." And then he said, "In fact, if you read Chesterton, you don't even need to read C.S. Lewis."
Oh, no.
That's what he said.
Okay.
And he said, I was hoping for that reaction. Good.
Do we censor this program? I can't remember.
Sit tight, kids. It gets worse. He said, because all of C.S. Lewis is in Chesterton. Now, my reaction was similar to yours. I thought he had just uttered blasphemy, right? But it stuck there. I didn't do anything with it except remember what he said. I should read Chesterton someday. And then as soon as I heard the name once, then all of a sudden I started seeing his name everywhere. Like this, C.S. Lewis is Surprised by Joy. He talks about how it was Chesterton who really conquered his atheism with the everlasting man. The young man who's serious about his atheism cannot be too careful about what he reads.
Yes.
Right.
And then I read Sheldon Van Auken's A Severe Mercy, and that reprints several letters from C.S. Lewis to Sheldon Van Auken. And in one of the letters, it says, you should read The Everlasting Man. It's probably the best work of Christian apologetics of our century. And so I'm thinking, okay, that's the book I'm going to read to introduce myself to G.K. Chesterton. I didn't pick up the book till about 2 or 3 years later, on my honeymoon.
Oh, wow.
So like anybody else, I started reading Chesterton on my honeymoon.
And your honeymoon was in Rome, I understand.
And yes, and like so many young Baptist evangelicals, I went to Rome on my honeymoon.
Did you buy a gun for your honeymoon the way Chesterton did?
Not quite. No, in fact, not at all. But
Wait. Why did Chesterton
On
buy
his
a gun?
honeymoon, he was an eccentric fellow. And didn't he stop and buy a gun and something else strange for his honeymoon?
some would say eccentric. I would call him extremely centric. But he bought a gun so he could defend his bride.
Right,
Wow.
Right. So it was a typical act of chivalry. And he also said, we're going to go on a honeymoon near Scotland. There might be a lot of Scottish people around.
Oh.
And then he also bought a glass of milk. And this was his honeymoon. This is the day of his marriage. He's on his way to getting married. He buys a glass of milk and a gun. And the glass of milk is because he always had great memories of walking with his mother, and she would buy him a glass of milk and he would drink it. And it was like a tribute to his mother before going off to take the new woman in his life.
Wow, what a
So
great
good,
story.
very good.
So let's go back to your honeymoon in Rome, and that's when you read Everlasting Man.
Yes, and The Everlasting Man was an encounter with what I discovered was the greatest mind I'd ever encountered. I thought Chesterton was the first writer I'd ever encountered who put it all together. I read a lot of great writers in my time, including C.S. Lewis, but I thought the span of what he was able to put together in that book, where he talks about history and art and poetry and literature and mythology and science and archaeology and then theology and philosophy, and it all converges. And it all converges, on that point in history where Jesus enters the stage and the world changes, and the way he builds up the argument and then comes away from it saying, you cannot explain history any other way than the Christian explanation. No other explanation makes any sense at all. So it's a lovely book, and this was after me struck. I mean, I don't know how much I even comprehended of this book. As with Chesterton, you always go back and you gain a lot more the next time you read him. Yeah.
It's interesting to read Lewis first and then read Chesterton, because you'll say, well, Chesterton stole that from Lewis. And you go, no, wait a minute. This is 30 years earlier.
Yeah.
But we had an earlier podcast of terms like child versus boy. And Chesterton says, I was wiser at 6 than I was at 16. And that exact vocabulary gets picked up in Surprised by Joy. In Pilgrim's Regress, the hermit called History basically gives a synopsis of Everlasting Man about how God planned the unfolding of history around the incarnation. Yeah, so the debt is very obvious once you spend a lot of time with both authors.
And I did kind of go on to realize how close Larry was to telling the truth. Every time I'd read a new passage from Chester, I go, oh, so this is where C.S. Lewis got this. Right. Well, this is where he got that. And all these things, even things like the screw-shaped letters, which seems like the most original piece there is. Chesterton wrote a thing called Half Hours in Hades. And it's basically a book of demonology, how different kinds of demons there are, what temptations they're used for.
Well, I've been researching the influence of Chesterton on Sayers, and I've come up with stuff that no Sayers scholars have ever talked about. So you
ought to give a talk about that, Crystal.
I am fortunate enough to be presenting it at the Chesterton conference that's coming up. So this Everlasting Man just impressed you. What was the next thing you picked up by Chesterton?
Yeah, so I read The Everlasting Man, and I remember just a few years ago I met a gentleman from Croatia who had translated The Everlasting Man into Croatian, and I remember him saying, his encounter was, I didn't understand this, but I want more. And that's how I felt. I know I didn't get all this, but I need more of this. And I really started just loading up on Chesterton books. Now, this is 1981, and most of Chesterton books are out of print. There's probably only 6 of his titles that are in print at this point. And so it means combing used bookstores and finding.
Right, it's not like going online, Googling the books.
There's no online in
81.
And so that's what I started doing, just looking everywhere for. And the second book I read was his book on St. Francis of Assisi. And then I read Orthodoxy and then Heretics. Those were the first 4 books that I read of Chesterton. And then it was anything I could get my hands on after that.
Well, it's wonderful now because on Gutenberg, many of the main titles are there. And Australian Gutenberg has even more titles. So you can download them and put them in Word and actually do a word search if you want to see what he said about this topic or another.
Well, and this is one of our grand projects of the Chesterton Society, David, is that we are assembling all of his works, which means we have really gone through all that uncollected journalism, because his books represent only a fraction of what he wrote, literally a fraction. And so we have got this amazing archive that we are going to be putting online as soon as we possibly can, the Chesterton Digital Library. And,
that's great.
Wow.
and so everybody, and we'll have a very good word search system. So this is your chance to really look up anything you want.
Because a lot of that public domain stuff is very poorly formatted, and you bring it into like an e-reader or something, and you're
it's not good.
Trying to make sense of the pages and the formatting and everything.
And plus, we're going to have a picture of the original article, but then we'll have a transcription of it, so you can actually search it in a text form. So it'll be really, really accessible and very readable.
Thank you for doing that.
Yeah, the search function is important for Chesterton because he had opinions about everything.
He wrote about everything, and it's an opinion you want to read. I wonder what Chesterton's perspective is on this.
Yes.
I literally, preparing for this podcast, I typed in modernism, and Chesterton says, well, if you want to call yourself a modernist, it just means right now. You might as well call yourself a Mondayist, because I had this idea on Monday. Maybe even a morningist, because it just occurred to me as it's just such a witty opinion, and it's such a perceptive opinion.
Right.
Sometimes he can be witty in a kind of a light rhetorical way, but other times you stop and think about the witticism and you go, boy, there's a lot of truth to that.
And what I love about him is he recognizes both the power and the poverty of language. That, like the word modernism, he was exposing the limitations of that word. But at the same time, he can use language and put words together in a way that makes you think of truths you've assumed your whole life, but they are filled with fireworks.
Yeah, Chester, he's very, very precise in his language, and yet at the same time, he points out the limits of language. He says, we're all wrestling in a fallen language like men in the folds of a fallen tent. Great image, great image.
Yeah, that is a great image, yeah.
And yet the idea, he says, of the writer is you have to try to be able to say the thing that can't be said.
Right.
And that's the great struggle of literature. You're trying to express the inexpressible, and that's always our goal.
Well, I've just been reading Tremendous Trifles, and it's a perfect title for what he's doing. He'll take the smallest thing and give you some real significance out of that item. He was saying, one time I wanted to write a book of poems about the things I found in my pocket.
Yes.
But it would have been an epic work, and the epic is no longer, but he does say the pocket knife is the infant of the sword. And there's another tremendous trifle about wanting to go do a painting on butcher paper. And he says, when you do something on brown paper, you realize that white is a color. It's not the absence of color. It's very positive. Yes. He says, white is what you draw stars with. And he says, it's the same thing with goodness and mercy. It's not the absence of vices. It's this positive thing.
Yeah.
Yes.
And he took such a simple idea and just makes you think all day about.
It seems like a trifle, and yet you go so profound with such a simple idea. He's talking about virtue being something positive, not just the absence of vice.
Right.
You can go all day on that. It's
Right.
true.
Yeah.
Well, and he recognizes the power of metaphor, which is what you're talking about.
Yeah.
That when you're trying to understand ideas that are fundamentally mystical, you've got to use new language. You've got to give parallels that create a type of shock in the brain.
And of course, the way he does shock the best is with paradox, right?
Yes.
Right.
And he's the master of paradox. He uses both forms of paradox: the apparent contradiction, but also the surprise, the truth that seems to be the opposite of what we expect. And he is completely the master of that, because he says we've gotten so used to seeing things the wrong way. We need to see them on our heads.
Oh, all that's what struck me as I've been reading Chesterton, is all his references to people being upside down, turning things, topsy-turvyism, and he was committed to that. You have to turn things upside down with your language to get people to push beyond their prejudices. And there's so much prejudice. He encountered the prejudice against Christianity in the early 20th century. And that's what makes him so relevant today, because we have just the exact same of intense prejudice against Christianity in our own era.
I mean, here's Chesterton, who made his living as a journalist and a secular journalist. And yet here he is defending Christianity in the secular newspapers.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
That's uncharted territory. And there aren't many journalists today doing the same thing.
Right. The example, and I may have shared it on an earlier podcast, of the antipathy towards Christianity while Chesterton was alive was a statement by Virginia Woolf when she heard that T.S. Eliot had become a Christian, and she said, "There is something obscene about a person sitting by the fire and believing in God." She actually used the word obscene, and that whole Bloomsbury, the artist group where they felt that they transcended Christianity, that culture had evolved beyond the need for it. And here was Chesterton just giving us new ways to think about it. I mean, the guy's brilliant.
And Virginia Woolf sort of epitomizes the sort of modernist that Chesterton was talking about.
Exactly.
In orthodoxy, what does he talk about? He says, when he's setting up his arguments for Christianity, he says, I've looked at modern philosophy, and they lead to madness. If you take any of their ideas to their logical conclusion, it leads to madness. But it's even worse. It leads to a suicidal madness. It's a self-destructive madness. And look how our friend Virginia Woolf ended up. It's easy for her to sit there pronouncing judgment on Christianity, but she ended up so depressed that she had to
drown herself.
And Chesterton talks about, the suicide doesn't kill one person; he kills every person. He actually murders everybody. In fact, he also destroys every tree and every flower and every bird. That's what he does. He destroys the whole world.
Wow.
And that's how Virginia Woolf ended her philosophy.
Wow. I've been rereading What's Wrong with the World lately, and I was impressed by the critique he gives of modern inventions that are going to make our lives simpler. And he gives this whole discussion about walking sticks and fire and toasters and things. And he's sort of saying that we invent something that does like one thing that fire does, like it toasts something, so we can toast some bread. But fire can do all those things and a bunch of other things. And so we end up inventing like 100 different inventions to replace fire. And his argument is, it feels like progress, but we're just sort of filling our lives up with stuff, and it takes more time. And so he's making this argument about sort of progress and the flaws in it. And it gets you really I think that's the thing that I like about Chester, is he gets you really thinking through stuff that you thought was a positive, or because it's new, or
it turns things upside down.
Yeah, and you go, oh wow, maybe we should be walking around with walking sticks.
And even the word progress. I mean, he makes fun of that word. Progress is always considered a good thing, but he said, well, you have to define what it is you're going towards before we know whether we're making any progress or not. But in the modern world's idea of use of the word, it's progress for progress's sake. It means it's a going on towards going on. That's all it is, because the goal has not been stated. He said progress is simply a comparative of which we have not established the superlative.
Right. Lewis picked up that theme. At one point, he wanted to. At one point, Lewis wanted to join a society for the prevention of progress. I want to read. We were talking about modernism and Virginia Woolf. I wanted to read Chesterton quote where he says, "Folklore means that the soul is sane, but the universe is wild and full of marvels. Realism means that the world is dull and full of routine, but the soul is sick and screaming."
Wow.
I thought that was really a perceptive comment. A lot of modern literature, it's almost unreadable unless you're a graduate student, because it's so depressing. And it's really not about the external world a person lives in. It's about their neuroses and their relationships and their existential angst. And as I say, unless you're trying to earn credits in grad school, it's not the kind of thing you would pick up for enjoyment.
Yeah.
And certainly not anything that a publisher should be interested in either.
Right.
And Chesterton does a lot with that in the book Orthodoxy, where the publisher's saying, that man's going to get on in the world. He believes in himself. And he said, it's all these people who believe in themselves that are in insane asylums.
Yeah.
and he says to the publisher, if you really believe that it's the man who believes in himself who's going to do so well? Why is it that you always go hide in the other room when he brings in his manuscript?
That's good. Aaron had brought up what's wrong with the world. And one of my favorite memories of something Chesterton did is evidently in a newspaper asked, what is wrong with the world? And Chesterton responded by saying, I am.
That's a great story, Crystal, but it's not quite true.
Rats.
I don't want to be a myth buster, all right? But
you should be.
It's close, though. It's very close. I mean, he did say this in a newspaper. In fact, the title of the article in the newspaper was, What's Wrong with the World?
Oh, really?
Yes. So, and it was probably 5 years before the book came out.
Oh, okay.
And it was a response to a letter to the editor. And and so it came under the heading, What's Wrong with the World? The newspaper is the Daily News. And he said, naturally, the right answer to the question, what's wrong with the world, is I am.
Mm-hmm.
But it's part of a much longer letter.
Oh,
It'd be nice if that were the whole letter.
Yeah.
But obviously that jumped off the page, so that was the story that was told. And as these things happen when they get passed on, that's all the only part of the letter that's ever quoted becomes the letter itself, right?
I looked for that quote everywhere because it's an illustration that gets shared a lot.
Yeah. And it is a Chesterton quote, except it's part of a longer one.
Interesting.
Does he also say in that article a statement that I've read elsewhere that, well, people should be asking what's right with the world?
Yeah, that's a different article. Yes. Okay. So after he wrote the book, What's Wrong with the World, an editor asked him to write an article, What's Right with the World? And so he did write that article, and he didn't. He was actually responding to his own book, saying, I don't want everyone to think there's only things wrong with the world. Here are all the things that are right. And we should be asking what's right with the world. And there's a wonderful passage in that essay where he says, birds will go bedwards and children won't to the end of the last evening. And daybreak is a never-ending glory, but getting out of bed is a never-ending nuisance.
Well, I think part of Chesterton's uniqueness is his tone. A lot of Christian writers, they know the Christians are in the minority, and it's all grievances and complaints, and it is what's wrong with the world.
Defensiveness.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
And there's this joy and sense of gratitude that comes up over and over again, and he enjoys being the advocate for the minority.
Oh, it's totally a joyful thing for him.
That positive energy, really, you can feel it 100 years later. He wasn't one of these doomsayers. It's simply because you all rejected Christianity.
Yeah.
He constantly kept saying, he says at one point, the cross can never be defeated, for it is defeat. I mean, the ultimate humiliation of God. And he understands the fountain of wonder and joy and gratitude that makes his faith something very winsome and attractive, rather than just, why don't you people believe this is why the world is so bad?
That's very important, David, because he gives this image from Nehemiah of the builders on the wall all had to have a sword in one hand and a trowel in the other.
Oh, yeah, right.
And he says, the trowel's the sword is the weapon of defense, and the trowel is the building weapon. But he says the sword represents reason. It's very interesting because when you defend the faith, you have to use reason to defend the faith, right? But you don't build anything with a sword. You have to have a creative tool. And that's really the act of love. And so he does emphasize the positive. He uses the sword to defend the trowel, and so he will use reason to skewer the bad arguments as they come in, but he wants to show this is what we're building, and so he will always take that negative, he uses reason in a positive way to put down the negative argument, but then he says this is what we're defending, and it's always a joyful thing. He always points to this good thing that we're doing that you can be part of too. Just get the right perspective. See the fact that the cross is the tree of life.
That would be a great name for a Christian pub, the Sword and Trowel.
Well, another thing I respect about Chesterton, which is consonant with what we're talking about, is that he would befriend people that he radically disagreed with. And he wasn't someone who participated in this polarization like we see in our culture today where, well, those are the bad guys. I'm not going to talk to them. But his famous relationship with George Bernard Shaw, for example, I admire his ability to build trust with those who will disagree with him and with whom he disagrees.
I mean, not only did he love his enemies loved him.
Yes.
That's what's so
Yeah.
amazing. Yeah.
Right.
And the point of loving your enemies is that you don't want to defeat them. You want to convert them. You want them to end up on your side. You want
Yeah.
you want your enemy to betray his side and come to your side.
Hmm.
And he did it by, using the sword just for the argument, but always keeping his personal charity and amity very clear,
Yeah.
so that people were never offended by him. They could not withhold their affection for him
Yes.
because he was so affectionate. And so these philosophical opponents of his, they all had great personal relationships with him. And
Yes.
and Shaw's a great example, but the other one is H.G. Wells,
H.G.
Yes.
Wells.
with whom they didn't agree on anything, on nothing, and yet they would spend weekends together at each other's homes.
Didn't you write Orthodoxy partly as a reply to the Outline of History by Wells?
Everlasting
really?
Man. Everlasting
Yeah,
Man.
excuse me,
Yeah.
Everlasting Man.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's right.
Okay.
It is really a response to Wells' book.
I loved his
wow.
quip. Somebody said, because Wells was already famous as a science fiction writer,
Right.
he started writing history and socialist tracts. And somebody said, well, how do you feel about Wells, the science fiction writer, turning into Wells, the socialist writer? And Chesterton said, well, I fear that he traded his birthright for a pot of message.
that's a good one.
This is one
Yeah,
of the, that's
he
one of
did,
the most
yeah.
great puns in the
Yeah.
world.
Yeah.
I like his responses though, because they're always a little self-deprecating. There's humility in them. They're almost jovial. He's not mean-spirited in his
Never.
criticism
Never.
or in his
And that's
apologetic.
what people picked up. His love.
Yeah.
He was committed to God, who is love, and he manifested that
Yeah.
in the
Truly.
way he
And it-
treated others.
And in places like in What's Wrong with the World, where he has this whole discussion about women and voting, which is very outdated at this point. But a lot of the arguments that he makes in there, he's kind of like, well, I could be wrong about this, but this is the way I see this topic. And so he's not, he doesn't tie something where he's talking about a current event to the Lord says, like scripture. He's very clear with the lines of like, well, this is what the Bible says, or this is based on some spiritual truth versus this is my opinion on this current event topic.
Well, I mean, his argument in What's Wrong with the World about feminism is simply that it's women wanting to be men.
Yeah.
And women, in order to do that, are giving up the one thing
Yeah.
that they can do that men can't do, which is be a mother.
Yeah.
Because he says women have always been able to do all the things that men have done, and often do them better, and
Yeah.
usually do them when men aren't doing them well enough,
Yeah.
out of necessity, when men aren't being men.
Yeah.
But the one thing that they can do is the one that man cannot do. They're giving up in order to do those feminist things. That's his argument, which is really quite profound, and that's where one of his most famous lines comes from the defense of the amateur in that book.
Oh, yeah.
A thing worth doing is worth doing badly.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
The other thing about Chesterton is his versatility, because we've been talking about him as a commentator on current events and a Christian apologist, but then you start getting into his fiction and his fantasy, his biographies of famous figures. He was amazingly versatile.
Well, his obituary said he'll be remembered as a poet, which he's not remembered as, but he was very famous as a poet in his lifetime, and I think that's one of very overlooked is his great poetry.
Lewis loved the Ballad of the White Horse, and so did Tolkien.
So did Tolkien. Yeah. And it's really one of the great epic poems of the English language, and it's only a few people appreciate how good it is.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Do you have a favorite Chesterton text?
What a horrible question.
Yeah. Do you have a favorite child?
Yeah.
Which of your 6 children do you love the most?
Yeah, you've asked such good questions till now. Well, I mean, there's a great Chesterton poem would be his poem "The Donkey." It's a poem that epitomizes Chesterton himself. When fishes flew and forests walked, and figs grew upon thorn, some moment when the moon was blood, then surely I was born, with monstrous head and sickening cry and ears like errant wings, the devil's walking parody on all 4-footed things. Then it goes on from there.
That's pretty impressive.
Yeah.
He says, "Starve, scourge, derive me, I am dumb. I keep my secret still. Fools, for I also had my hour, one far fierce hour and sweet, there were shouts about my ears and palms before my feet. Yeah. And so there's this poem about this donkey, the tattered outlaw of the earth. And, here is Chesterton. He is the humble man saying, you can make fun of me all you want, but I had that moment when I carried Christ.
Yes.
And that gives me a perspective that you should want. You should want to have that humble perspective of being able to carry Christ. And that's a lovely poem. I'm sorry, I forgot 2 lines. Someday I'll send you those other 2 lines. But some of his, I happen to be a big fan of his essays. I think he's the master of the essay. He's written 5,000 essays.
Wow.
And his ability to compress, a huge, gigantic argument into a 1,500-word essay and doing it in such a way that you think he's going one direction and you're watching him circle. What's he doing? And then zoom, he zooms in for the kill with a closing line that is as good as the revelation at the end of a mystery story.
Right.
And he has a way of just, making your heart start with such a brilliant short treatment of something profound.
Tell us a little bit about the Chesterton schools that you were involved in, and it's rapidly becoming a movement, it sounds like to me.
Yeah, it has happened. Truly turned into a movement in spite of my efforts. We started the first Chesterton Academy in the Twin Cities where I live in Minnesota. It's a high school, 9 through 12, and it's a very classical curriculum and also very Catholic. We use the faith as the center of the curriculum, and it's incarnational. The incarnation is what informs everything. And it's a truth that, as Chesterton says, if it's true, it's relevant to everything. If it's not true, it's irrelevant to everything, right? That's what he says about Christianity. Well, so we teach classical literature, classical philosophy, and history, and we take it right through to the present time. We follow the story of history, which is the story of salvation, and the development of philosophy and art and literature, so that they start by reading Homer and Plato and the Old Testament, and we finish by reading, Dostoevsky and some of the modern church encyclicals, and showing both the peaks in history where thought was at its highest and then the decline. We can look at the standards. So these kids have something to measure where the great thinking reached its apex and how it's fallen apart since. And we prepare them well to meet the world. As a result, they study 4 years of art, so they are painting oil masterpieces.
Wonderful.
By the end. They're 3 years of drama, so they're performing Shakespeare by the end of the time there. 4 years of required music. These are not extracurriculars. These are not electives. It's required. They study Latin, and if they don't study Latin for 4 years, they can do 2 years of required Latin, and then they can either study French or Italian or Spanish, and then 4 years of philosophy, which high school curriculums just don't have philosophy at all.
Well, and increasingly college curriculums don't have philosophy
throwing it all
anymore.
together. So you have to learn how to think and see how reason does not contradict faith. They actually work together. But then if they learn how to recognize a bad argument, so you studied logic as ninth graders, they understand what a fallacious argument is right away. And they become very irritating at the dinner table.
I would like a course called From Kierkegaard to the Kardashians. How did we get from serious existential philosophy to the social media world we live in now?
There is definitely an interesting line to follow there, David.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
But so anyways, the Chesterton Academies started grassroots movement. The first one started 14 years ago. By the end of the next school year, there'll be 50 of these schools.
Amazing.
In the U.S. and we have some in Canada. We've got one starting in Erbil, Iraq, which of course there's going to be a Chesterton Academy there.
Yeah.
And one in Sierra Leone, Africa.
Wow. Is the one in Iraq in the Kurdish regions?
Yes.
Yeah, they have a lot of Christians up there in the north.
Yes.
People don't realize.
Yeah, the Archbishop of Erbil has been really supportive, and the Kurds like him too, because he he's protecting local culture there too. Against, yeah, and so there's an interesting working relationship between a major Christian figure and a major Muslim government.
Oh, yeah.
Well, this podcast is listened to in several predominantly Muslim countries. So there is a thirst there for intelligent ways, again, to turn upside down those cliches that cause resistance towards Christianity, and to help us see the truth, which is what Chesterton did so brilliantly, and why both C.S. Lewis and Dorothy Sayers credit him as being a major influence on their spiritual life.
Yeah, he makes the truth attractive, but he also makes it reasonable.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's a great place to end our podcast. Thank you so much, Dale, for joining us today. This has been a fantastic conversation.
A blessing for me to be with both of you, and thank you for your kindness.
Wonderful conversation.
God bless.
The Wade Center podcast is a production of the Marion E. Wade Center at Wheaton College in Wheaton, Illinois. Our hosts are the co-directors of the Wade Center, Drs. Crystal and David C. Downing. Our episodes are produced and edited by Aaron M. Hill. If you enjoy the podcast and the content we offer, please leave us a review on iTunes, tell your friends, and consider making a donation to the Wade. The Wade Center is entirely self-funded. Financial gifts help support the expert services, vast collections, and varied programming we offer at no cost. If you have questions about the podcast or suggestions for future episodes, please email us at wade@wheaton.edu or contact us via Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. To learn more about the Wade Center, our 7 British Christian authors, what we offer, and how to make a donation, visit our website at wheaton.edu/Wade.